Welcome,
Hello.
Dorothy.
Hello, Joe. Hello, Tom. Hello, Mark.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
We got a chance to talk a little bit uh, about grief in another show during COVID, but I'm fascinated by this, the anatomy of grief. Can you tell us about the book? How did you come up with the title, The Anatomy of Grief?
What will I start with first? The anatomy, well, obviously people know what grief is, but why we called it anatomy is I talk about the structure of grief throughout the book in very many different ways. And what it's about what happens to the human self. And what I mean by when when grief comes into your life, when you lose a loved one. And what I mean by that is the brain gets grief stricken. You can't think clearly. It's hard to remember things. The heart is hurting. Um, the metaphorical heart, people will say, I have a hole in my heart. My heart hurts. Also, biologically, I mean, there's something that actually can happen. It's very rare, but it's called broken heart syndrome, which is also called the formal name, the medical name is Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And the third part of this is how the body hurts. The body just, yearns for the loved one. And this is grief. And grief is also, if you would look at how you could define it, well, simply put, it's the intense sorrow that we feel after a loved one dies. But broadly put, if you think about it, Darwin said grief is universal, and it is. It cuts across species, and it's also timeless. It can go back. Well, I talk about this in the book. I write about it. Can go back millions and millions of years, and there's an unpredictability to grief. Let me back up just a minute. This happens to everyone at some point of their life. And one doesn't know how long it's going to last. It has its own timetable for everyone, actually. And grief belongs to the griever. No one can tell the bereaved, it's about time. Don't you think it's about time that you just moved on? That's just not fair, and it's not appropriate. The griever owns their own grief. And another part of this is that grief, which is a crisis, actually, when somebody dies, this can create growth. This can help with a transformation. All of us change. And in the depth of all of this sorrow, there can be great change. And, if you think about hardship or something difficult, just think about learning a subject. You've got a new textbook, a new course you're into, and it looks awful. How can I do this? But you do, and what you're learning is how to tolerate discomfort. And think of somebody who's a runner or a tennis player. I mean, they don't say, I'm not going to do this because it hurts too much. Well, it's the same in some ways for grief. To be able to endure it, to experience it, to allow it, that's what helps it quiet. And it does quiet eventually. But part of its unpredictability is that it can erupt at any time. Amazingly, for example, I tell the example of somebody going to a movie and seeing one of the actors that kind of reminds her or him of the father that has died. And well, I'll make it the woman. And she comes outside and all of a sudden she simply bursts into tears and not knowing where did this come from, but sitting down and realizing that, that man really reminded me of my father. And you know what? It's going to be the anniversary of his death. next week. And of course, I'm more sensitive to it. So this is part of what grief is. And another characteristic of it is it depends on the relationship the bereaved had with the loved one. And it also depends on the bereaved, what their attachment history was. Was it a secure attachment? Were they able to tolerate separations, absences from their mom or the caretaker? That all contributes to what kind of grief someone can feel. And this can segue into what I'd like to talk about, which is the forms of grief. In my second chapter in The Anatomy of Grief, I read about the different forms that grief can take. And this is, I see grief like this, not in 5 stages, which don't work at all.
The Kubler-Ross thing doesn't work, the 5 stages?
Well, oh no. You know, where this came from with her was from her classic book that she wrote in 1969 on death and dying.
Right.
This is where stage theory and 5 stages came from. And what she did with this is explain, and she did a lot of research. It's a wonderful and classic book. These were the emotional changes that somebody who's terminally ill faces before they're about to die. Well, you can't deny that death has happened. This is one of the stages of dying. You can't really bargain for, as people who were terminally ill, as this is one of the stages, bargaining for their life. Well, you can't bargain that death doesn't happen, because it did. And you can just go through all of these and they just don't make sense with grief. But it just came, it was in the American consciousness, well, since 1969 when she wrote that book. And it was as though it just naturally fell into thinking about grief, but it's become a pop culture idea, really. It simply doesn't work. And I can't say that strongly enough.
Interesting. I mean, because how can you bargain once you've already lost someone?
Right, exactly. And, you know, I see, if I can, I think it might be helpful and interesting to talk about the forms of grief that I talk about in the book. I really list about, 16 or almost 20 of them.
Wow.
But I have to make clear, Joe, that these are not diagnostic disorders like in DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that the American Psychiatric Association publishes. And that one was 2013. No.
Right. And I am totally fine with that, because I have we talked about words matter before.
Absolutely.
I don't use the word disorder at all.
Disorder
separates people into a group that's ordered, a group that isn't. It's stigma. But tell us about these different types of grief that human beings can experience. These forms.
Well, and some of them you already know, the public already knows. Anticipatory grief. This is the grief that we experience when one is under the threat of death. A loved one is about to die or has a terminal illness or a kind of chronic, debilitating, finally terminal illness like Parkinson's. Well, you know, we've all felt this anticipatory grief during COVID. We've all, as a nation, felt that in the sense of how many more people are going to die. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, that death toll is going down. But that's one of the forms of grief, anticipatory, and many of my patients have experienced that.
Dorothy, let me just chime in there.
Sure.
The death toll is not going down. The rate is going down, but the death toll will never go down.
Well, true. That's true. That was a
right?
That word was wrong.
but I think that this is why your book is so important right now, because we have a nation that is grieving.
Yes, absolutely.
And so, tell me more.
Well, you know, just to pick up on that, I wrote an op-ed piece, February 22nd. It was published in The Hill, Washington, D.C. publication.
Great.
And it came out the afternoon of President Biden's second memorial over, memorializing over 500 million people who had died of COVID. So, and in this, the name of it is, it's the collective grief we must face. And
I think it's 500,000.
What did I say?
500 million. That would be.
Joe, I have to tell you, my zeros have always been kind of mixed up.
That's all right. It's all right.
Thank you.
But go on.
Okay, so 500 million. What did I say again?
That's what you said. It's 500,000.
Say that again.
Okay. So why didn't I say 500,000?
Good. Well,
okay, thank you. Anyway, another form of grief is ambiguous grief. Pauline Boss.
Can we go back to the other one first?
Which one? Anticipatory?
Yeah. Is there a guilt component to that feeling, that emotion?
There could be. Yeah. That's a wonderful question, Mark. And the guilt would be attached to, when a caretaker or relative is taking care of somebody who is dying, and it goes on and on and on, and it can be really traumatic. And they feel, oh, when is this going to be over? When are they going to die? And then they feel hideously, hideously guilty about thinking that. It's perfectly normal. There's exhaustion that you feel after you've been doing this over and over, taking care of the loved one. And some of the times, given whatever they have in terms of an illness, there can be EMTs coming to the house because there's a sense, okay, I think they're dying now, and they call 911, and it doesn't happen, and that can happen repeatedly. One of my patients had such a response to hearing sirens. It took a long time for after her husband died, because there were so many times that the EMTs came to the house and took him to the hospital. So yes, one can feel guilt about this. And it's important to understand, I think, for anyone who's grieving, that it's okay to have thought that. And another, actually this there's just so much to talk about. But one of the things that has been happening during COVID that I've been so strongly I respond to is what our frontline workers have been going through. I mean, they're the heroes in many ways of this COVID, this pandemic that we're living in and have lived through. But what they've gone through, being with patients who are dying and can't have their loved ones with them because of COVID, and COVID patients die alone, just maybe saying a virtual goodbye on an iPhone or an iPad. This is awful. And those doctors, nurses, other people, clinicians who are in the hospital, they've gone through this over and over and over, and they've experienced their own trauma. And a colleague of mine has written about this, along with colleagues of hers, calling this vicarious trauma. And I think that's a very, very apt term for what they're experiencing. And, we hope that they've been able to debrief with coworkers on the unit, with friends, with family. And, a lot of them could be helped by psychotherapy, but not everybody. It just depends how one deals with that kind of experience. Does that answer your question, Mark? I went way off.
No, absolutely. The whole guilt component was answered brilliantly. Stretch the canvas, rush with madness. Is it sadness or just a show?